You are standing under a shower. Or maybe you're caught in a sudden downpour, hunching your shoulders as cold water soaks through your jacket to your skin. After just a few minutes, a deep, primal discomfort sets in. Your fingers prune. A chill climbs your spine, seeking your core. Your whole body is shouting at you to find shelter, to get dry, to get warm. Now, imagine that feeling. But instead of a 5-minute walk to your front door, there is no door, no roof, no towel, and the rain does not stop in 5 minutes. It does not stop for a month. 30 days, 720 hours of relentless, cold precipitation. The world becomes a soaked sponge. The ground turns to a sucking mire. Every leaf, every patch of earth, every potential den is waterlogged. Prey animals burrow deep or vanish. Hunger becomes a constant, gnawing companion, sharpened by the endless work of simply staying alive in the damp. For you, a modern human with a metabolism fine-tuned for a stable, sheltered existence, this would be a death sentence. In a matter of days from exposure, from hypothermia, from a body pushed past its limits. But for one creature, this wasn't a death sentence. It was a crucible. And surviving it didn't just change their species. It ultimately changed the entire world, and led directly to you reading this now. This is the story of the prehistoric wolf in a global superstorm, and the impossible biological tricks they used to endure what should have wiped them out. The story begins not with a snarl, but with a shiver. To understand the scale of the problem, you have to erase the modern map from your mind. Picture North America, but not as it is. This was the peak of the last ice age, a world of giants and extreme climates. And while we often think of ice ages as just being colder, the reality was a planet of violent weather swings. One of the most dramatic periods scientists have identified from ancient climate data is a time of catastrophic, prolonged rainfall. We're not talking about a wet season. This was a climatic anomaly, a tipping point where the atmosphere's balance broke and dumped its contents on the land below for weeks on end. For the megafauna, the mammoths, the giant ground sloths, the mastodons, this was a major inconvenience. Their sheer size was both an advantage and a curse. They could wallow through mud that would trap smaller creatures, but their massive bodies required enormous amounts of food, and the rain would have flattened the grasses and shrubs they depended on. For smaller predators and scavengers, it was a desperate scramble. But for the wolf, a social, endurance-based hunter built for the open plains and boreal forests, this was an existential crisis. Their entire survival manual was suddenly obsolete. The wolf's legendary stamina, its ability to lope for miles tracking a scent, the rain would have washed away scent trails entirely. Their strategy of testing prey, of looking for the weak and the young in a herd, the herds would have been dispersed, disoriented, or migrated away from the flooded lowlands. Their thin summer coats, designed for shedding heat after a chase, would have become soaked weights, dragging down their energy reserves and leaching body heat with terrifying efficiency. In a dry cold, a wolf's coat is superb insulation. In a wet cold, it becomes a funeral shroud. Every single thing they had evolved to be good at was neutralized. This was the ultimate bad matchup. So, the question isn't just how they survived. The first, more brutal question is, did they even survive at all? The odds were catastrophically against them. If you took a modern wolf pack and dropped it into that same scenario, even with all their cunning, they would likely perish. The energy math simply wouldn't work. The calories burned just to maintain body temperature in constant wetness would outpace the calories they could possibly catch from a depleted, hidden food supply. It's a funnel, narrowing to a single, inevitable point: extinction. And yet, we know they did survive. Their descendants are everywhere. The proof is in the genetics of every dog that has ever put its head on your lap. So something happened in that relentless downpour. A switch was flipped, not a conscious decision, but a brutal, evolutionary pressure cooker that forced a change in behaviors so profound, it altered the very trajectory of the species. The wolves that made it through those 30 days weren't just the strongest or the fastest. They were almost certainly the weirdest. The ones who did something their ancestors would have considered pointless or even dangerous. Researchers who study canine evolution believe the key wasn't about becoming better wolves in the traditional sense. It was about becoming something else entirely, even if just for a little while. The survival manual didn't just need a new chapter. It needed to be thrown out and rewritten from a single, counterintuitive principle. And that principle was born from a fundamental shift in what they perceived as a resource and what they perceived as a threat. Think about your own deepest instincts in a crisis. When resources vanish, your worldview narrows. You stop thinking about luxury, about the future, about social niceties. You focus on the absolute fundamentals: calories, warmth, safety. For a wolf, those fundamentals are clear. Meat is a resource, the pack is safety. Rival predators are a threat. But what if, in this drowned world, the very definitions of resource and threat began to blur? What if the thing that seemed like the greatest threat held the only key to the last remaining resource? The leading theory is that this endless rain triggered a cascade of desperation that broke a million-year-old taboo. It forced the wolf to look not at the vast, empty, rain-lashed horizon for salvation, but down at the mud beneath its feet, and then towards the flicker of firelight in the distance. The storm didn't just test their bodies. It tested the limits of their wildness. And the survivors were those who discovered that in a world where all the old rules were dead, the only way to live was to quietly, cautiously rewrite them. This is where the story splits from pure ecology and becomes something deeply, intimately personal. Because this survival wasn't a solo act, the wolf did not endure this trial alone. There was another species on the landscape, struggling just as profoundly through the same relentless rain. A species that was physically weaker, slower, with poorer senses in almost every category. A species that should have been easy prey. But this species had one thing the wolf did not: a mind that could manipulate the environment itself. They had created pockets of order in the chaos. They had built shelters that, while not waterproof, were drier than the open air. They had mastered fire, creating rings of warmth and light that pushed back the damp and the dark. And they generated something else: middens. Piles of discarded bones, shattered marrow cavities, and scraps of skin that represented a calorie source that required no chase, no fight, no risk of a fatal kick or gore. To the starving, freezing wolf, these human campfires represented a paradox. They were the epicenter of the ultimate threat, an intelligent, tool-using predator that could kill from a distance. But they were also, unmistakably, the epicenter of the only reliable resource left in a drowned world: waste, shelter, and ambient warmth. This set up an evolutionary dilemma of unimaginable tension. The instinct to fear the strange bipeds was ancient and powerful, but the instinct to starve and freeze to death was more immediate. The wolves that survived the 30-day rain, researchers suspect, were the ones whose fear threshold was just slightly different. Not gone, but dialed down. They were the curiosities, the outliers who could withstand the terrifying novelty of human proximity long enough for a new equation to form in their minds: that the two-legged creatures were not just a source of danger, but potentially a source of salvage. This is the pivotal, silent moment. Not a friendship, not domestication. That came millennia later. This was a simple, desperate calculation of energy economics. Investigating the scary thing burned calories. But if the scary thing's trash heap offered more calories than it cost to investigate, then the investigation could become a viable strategy. And this is where we find the first concrete, physical trick to their survival. It wasn't in their muscles or their teeth. It was in their stomachs, and in a biological gamble so extreme it borders on the suicidal. Because to eat the scraps of a human campsite, they had to be able to eat almost anything. Here is where the popular imagination gets it wrong. We picture a wolf skulking at the edge of firelight, gobbling down a mammoth steak. The reality was far less glamorous and far more telling. They weren't eating prime cuts. They were eating the stuff even the humans wouldn't touch: boiled, gnawed, marrow-sucked bones, cartilage, burnt fat stuck to hides, rotten scraps fished from ash piles. This was a diet of last resort, and a wolf's digestive system was not built for it. A true carnivore's gut is a short, fast, acidic pipeline designed to process fresh meat and little else. But the scraps around a human camp were not fresh. They were cooked, which changes protein structures. They were aged. They were often mixed with inedible ash, charcoal, and dirt. For most wolves, eating this would have been a digestive disaster leading to sickness, weakness, and death, the exact opposite of survival. So how did they do it? The leading theory points to a hidden population already living on the edge. Before the rain, the wolf packs were not monoliths. There were the alphas, the hunters, the core of the pack. And then there were the outliers, the adolescents driven out to make their own way. The older wolves, slower, hanging on the fringes. The ones with slightly more tolerance for stress or slightly less rigidity in their behavior. These were the wolves for whom the old rules were already not working perfectly. They were already scavenging more than hunting, already taking risks others wouldn't. And crucially, their gut microbiomes, the universe of bacteria in their digestive tracts, were likely already more diverse, more chaotic, more prepared for a questionable meal, simply because they'd been eating a more questionable diet. When the superstorm hit, these fringe wolves had a perverse head start. While the elite hunters waited for a scent trail that would never come, the outliers were already conditioned to look for opportunity in chaos. They were the first to drift towards the strange, smoky smells on the wind, and their guts, already toughened by hardship, could handle the first, tentative bites of human refuse without shutting down. This wasn't evolution in the sense of a new gene appearing. This was evolution as a brutal filtering process. The rain didn't create a new kind of wolf. It simply killed all the wolves who couldn't do this one bizarre, undignified thing. Stomach our garbage. But eating the scraps was only half the battle. The other half was staying alive long enough to find them again. And this is where the second trick comes in. A trick written not in their guts, but in their social code. A wolf pack is a masterpiece of coordination, but also of rigid hierarchy. Every movement, every hunt, every meal is governed by strict rules of dominance and submission. In normal times, this structure is what makes them lethal. In the rain, it became a liability. The pack must move as one. But what if the alpha's strategy is leading them all to starvation? What if a younger wolf senses a chance near a human camp, but to pursue it means breaking rank, wandering off, defying the chain of command? In a landscape where food was scattered in tiny, unpredictable pockets, the old commandment of stick together at all costs could be a death sentence for the entire group. The survivors, researchers think, were from packs where this social glue had temporarily dissolved, not out of rebellion, but out of sheer, survival-induced desperation. The pressure was so immense that the only strategy left was a form of temporary, tolerated independence. A lower-ranking wolf could peel off, follow a hunch towards the smoke, and if it returned with food in its belly, or better yet, with a marrow bone to drag back, it wasn't met with punitive aggression. It was, for the first time, met with quiet acceptance. The value system flipped. In the dry world, the greatest virtue was loyalty to the hunt. In the drowned world, the greatest virtue became caloric yield, regardless of how it was obtained. This created a new, prototype of wolf, one that could operate in a liminal space. It could return to the pack's loose, rain-soaked temporary den, but it could also venture, alone and hypervigilant, into the terrifying periphery of a human campsite. It became a biological switch hitter. And this duality had a side effect that would echo for millennia. It selected for wolves who could read an entirely new set of signals. They had to learn to read the humans from a distance, the sounds of activity versus rest, the posture of threat versus indifference. They had to become experts not in the body language of elk, but in the body language of this new, dangerous creature. This forced a cognitive expansion. Their world was no longer just prey, rival, and pack. It now contained a new, terrifyingly intelligent category, potential, not friend, not enemy, a volatile, unpredictable source of opportunity. And this brings us to the third and most subtle trick, the one that truly changed everything. It was a trick of communication, but not with barks or howls. It was the communication of intentional harmlessness. To get close enough to scavenge, without being driven off or killed, a wolf had to broadcast a signal humans could understand. It couldn't use wolf signals. A lowered tail, or averted gaze in wolf language is submission. But to an armed human, a skulking, tail-tucked predator still looks like a predator about to strike. The wolf had to invent, through trial and fatal error, a new vocabulary. It had to move slowly, not with a hunter's stalk. It had to sit at a very specific distance, close enough to be seen as non-threatening, far enough to flee if a spear was raised. It had to learn to avoid direct eye contact, but also not to look away too quickly, which could signal guilty intent. The wolves that mastered this delicate dance, this performance of being just harmless enough, gained exclusive access to the only sustainable calorie stream on the landscape. And the humans, in the middle of their own desperate struggle with the rain, began to see something in return. From the human perspective, the sight at the edge of the firelight shifted. At first, it was a threat, a pair of eyes glowing in the dark. Then, it was a nuisance, a scavenger to be chased off. But as the weeks wore on, and the rain kept falling, the presence of the wolf changed. It became a signal. A wolf lingering calmly meant no larger predators were immediately nearby. The wolf itself was too cautious to stick around if there was a saber-tooth in the bushes. Its coming and going could indicate changes in the weather or the movement of other game. And its relentless, focused scavenging cleaned the campsite, removing bones and refuse that would otherwise attract insects and worse vermin. A silent, mutual tolerance emerged. baked in the cold misery of a rain that wouldn't end. It wasn't affection. It was a détente between two species who had both found the other, against all instinct, to be slightly more useful alive than dead. The evidence for this isn't in a single dramatic fossil. It's in a pattern that appears right after the climate data shows these intense wet periods. The archaeological record shows a curious thing. Wolf remains and human artifacts start being found in closer and closer proximity. Not in the same graves, not yet, but in the same layers of soil, around the same hearths. The bones tell the story. These are not the bones of wolves hunted for food. They don't have the cut marks of butchery. They are often older individuals, or younger ones, who died of natural causes, near human settlements. They are the outliers who made this their niche. And there's a physiological clue, too, locked in the stress levels of those ancient bones. Studies of canine fossils from this transitional period show a telltale signature. The bones of wolves living near humans have less evidence of the violent trauma seen in those from the deep wild. Fewer healed fractures from kicks of large prey, fewer injuries from fights with other predators. But they show different marks of stress, microscopic wear on. Their teeth suggest a diet that was grittier, full of ash and soil from rooting in middens. It was a trade, a safer life, with a less noble menu. The superstorm eventually passed. The skies cleared, the land drained, and the old world re-emerged. The herds returned to the plains. The normal rules of wolf life were theoretically back on the table. But something irreversible had happened. A door had been cracked open. A new niche had been discovered, and a lineage of wolves had been permanently shaped to fit it. They were no longer just wolves of the wild hunt. They were wolves of the threshold, specialists in the space between the forest and the firelight. And when the next crisis came, a harsh winter, a drought, another storm, that door would swing open a little wider. The tolerance would deepen, inch by inch, generation by generation, into something that looked more like partnership. The wolf would start to offer something more active than just being harmless. It would start to bark a warning at approaching dangers. The human would start to offer something more deliberate than just passive waste. They would start to toss a scrap intentionally. But all of that, the true journey to domestication, to the first dog, that came later. The first and most important step was survival. And survival was achieved not through strength, but through a series of quiet, desperate, ingenious compromises. A toughened stomach, a loosened social tether, and the learned, fragile art of holding very, very still at the edge of the light, praying the two-legged creature would look at you and see something other than a threat. See, just for a moment, a fellow survivor. The rain did stop. The sun finally broke through, and the world began to steam. The desperate truce at the campsite edge could have ended there. Both species could have walked back into their separate worlds and never looked back. But they didn't, because the storm didn't just leave behind mud and drowned landscapes. It left behind a memory, etched into the survival circuits of both creatures. For the humans, the memory was of a pair of eyes in the dark that, over time, stopped looking like hunger and started looking like watchfulness. For the wolves, the memory was of a place where, if you mastered the art of stillness, the gnawing emptiness in your belly would fade. A dangerous comfort is still a comfort, and the world is full of dangers. So when the weather turned harsh again, as it always does, the path of least resistance wasn't to invent a new survival strategy from scratch. It was to walk back to the faint, familiar glow on the horizon. The détente became a habit. The habit became a tradition. And over generations, that tradition wired itself into biology. The wolves who were best at reading human moods had more pups. The humans whose camps were subtly guarded by these quiet shadows slept more soundly. The two species, without ever deciding to, were weaving their fates together. But this story isn't really about them. Not those ancient wolves. Not those struggling humans. This story is about you, right now, in this moment. It's about the reason your heart just unclenched a little when you read that they found a way. Because you are the final, living proof that their desperate gamble worked. You are not descended from the wolves, of course, but you are the heir to the humans who stood on the other side of that firelight. And if those humans had not made that same, quiet calculation, to tolerate the strange, to look past instinct and see potential, your entire world would be different. Colder, quieter, infinitely more lonely. Think about the dog at the foot of your bed, the one who hears a bump in the night and lifts its head, a low growl in its throat. That is not just a pet. That is a direct, living conduit back to that first, shivering wolf at the edge of the rain-lashed camp. Its instinct to warn you is the polished, perfected version of that wolf's calculation. If I make myself useful to the two-legged creature, I get to stay near the warmth. That soft, trusting weight against your leg is the ultimate rewrite of a wild commandment. The tail that wags at the sound of your voice is a biological signal that has traveled over 15,000 years to say, asterisk, I am not a threat. See, I am harmless. I am yours, asterisk. And in you, the human on the other end of the leash, something was rewritten too. The part of your brain that feels a swell of irrational tenderness when a puppy tilts its head, that finds comfort in the rhythm of another creature's breathing as you fall asleep. That is your inheritance. Your ancestors didn't just domesticate the wolf. In the process, they domesticated a piece of their own humanity. They nurtured a capacity for cross-species trust so profound. It shaped our art, our myths, our very understanding of loyalty. So the next time you come in from the rain, when you peel off your soaked jacket, towel your hair, and feel that deep relief as the chill leaves your bones, pause for just a second. Listen. You might hear the click of claws on the floor as your dog comes to greet you, or you might just feel the memory of it. A ghost limb of companionship so ancient it feels like a part of you. That is the legacy of the superstorm. Not just survival, but the beginning of a bond that softened the edges of a hard world. The wolves that endured didn't just save themselves. They gave us our first, best lesson in looking at the other, the different, the frightening, the wild, and seeing not just what it is, but what it could be. They taught us that sometimes salvation doesn't come from fighting the storm. It comes from having the courage to sit, shivering, at the edge of the light and wait to see who else is willing to share the warmth. And in the end, that is why you are here. Because one soaked, starving creature looked at another across a pile of bones and ash. And instead of seeing only danger, they saw a reflection of their own will to live. Everything that followed, every hearth guarded, every hunt shared, every hand that ever reached out to scratch behind a grateful ear, was just the long, slow drying out after the rain finally stopped.